welcome to another edition of Table Talk, and today we are blessed to have Anthony with us, and we're going to be discussing the influences, or the influence our father has on our lives when we're young and how it still affects us when we're older as well. So I'm going to just go straight over to Fumi first of all, in terms of, you know, when your physical, we're not talking about Heavenly Father just yet, we'll get into that in a second, but in terms of your physical father, how was that a good influence or indifferent or?
Oh no, 100%. My dad was very calm, very you could wind around your finger really if you wanted to. My mom was the disciplinarian, my dad wasn't. We knew how to go around my dad. Yeah. and I remember, I mean, he died when we were, well, I was 12, 13, probably 13 then. So I only have little memories of him still left, and they're all good memories. Yeah, I think my quiet, some people think I'm not quiet, but I am really quiet. I'm more open when I'm with people I'm comfortable with, and I'm probably more like him. Yeah, he was lovely.
Quiet, yeah.
But he had his moments. He had his moments of some things that sort of like, wow, why would you do that? Or yeah, it was.
So what in terms of, you know, the spiritual aspect of a faith aspect, did they have an influence in that shape before?
Both my parents did. Both my parents were religious. My dad was Methodist, and so we went, because my mom was Roman Catholic, you had to go to the Roman Catholic church, worship services and so on. But he never went to that. He had his own faith, and so sometimes, so this is what happens when you have parents with active in two different faiths. Then you go to the one and then you go to the other. Yeah. And that's how we were bounced up. So we went with him, in terms of what we go with him to whatever. We still believe in God and believe in Jesus, but it would be like either the spiritualist church or some Pentecostal church, or even if it was dabbling in the traditional arts, African arts, whether you call it a witch art or whatever it was, he will take you to it, and my mom will take you to her own. So yes, I was influenced in different ways by my dad, good and not so. Yeah. Not so.
So Anthony, tell us a little bit about yourself first, the background, and then we can get into your experience with your father.
Yeah, so I was born in the UK, so I'm British. I'm from a family of originally 8, 4 boys, 4 girls. Wow. Lost my brother when he was 54 due to alcohol, which we'll get back onto a little bit later on in regards to my dad. And we grew up in impoverished circumstances back in the 60s. Home life was chaotic, but I came to faith very early on, in a situation where I was not a member of any church, or I didn't grow up with any church-type influences. But like most Caribbean families, you have a Bible in the home, and I used to read it when I was about 13, and that's how my faith grew. That's how I became a Christian, through really reading the Bible over the years. So
was your dad religious?
My father wasn't religious, my mother weren't religious. They were, most Caribbeans of that generation would have been influenced by other Christian influences. So the Caribbean islands are always, as you know, like in Africa, are heavily spiritual. They have the heritage of, in this case, in the Caribbean, Christianity. Both my parents were from St. Kitts, a very tiny island, which I've never been to, which I'd love to go to at some point, just to see it. So there would have been an influence of Christianity when they grew up, I'd imagine. But as a family growing up, no, there was very little religious, from what I can remember, influences as such, although we were aware of Christianity, and because you go to the state school, and of course you had assemblies.
Yes.
So the influence was there as well. But but unfortunately, my dad had struggled with alcohol, and he was an alcoholic for a long time. And with his alcohol, he became pretty violent, particularly towards my mother and certain members of my family, particularly my older sisters. So I've got memories which are very painful to share, but they're nonetheless they're still with me, and it caused issues for me in terms of my relationship with my dad as I got older. Though I did love him, I didn't. That side of him I could not understand. And it's interesting that there's a lot of talk nowadays about boys being how they're influenced in a family where there's what they call misogynistic behaviour, abuse against women, and that's now a hot topic that I hear quite often in the media. And I listen to it with interest, having grown up in a toxic environment. The difficulty I have with my dad is that he was a very gifted man. He could sing, he could play guitar, he could play a harmonica, and I still got his harmonica at home. Both my parents died back in the 90s. My mother died January 94. I found my dad dead in March of 94 when I was getting ready to go to work. And that really gave a lot of problems for my older brother who died when he was 54. So we've got a history of addiction in terms of alcohol in our family, and it's affected us in very different ways.
It's interesting because I was raised in a non-religious family, and alcohol played a big part in our household. There was always parties, there was alcohol everywhere. I remember when my parents used to go out, we used to go, in those days they used to have like a drink cabinet. And in the drink cabinet it was filled with all kinds of different spirits, vodka, whiskey and things. And I remember just getting pint tumblers and just filling it up with everything and drinking it and getting absolute plastered and things like that. I don't know if, because I never had an alcohol problem, I don't know if that was an influence of it, possibly, because it was my choice, but maybe it was, I thought that was normal to go down that road.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think that's the thing about it. When you grow up in a certain environment, you can take identical twins and put one in one environment and one in the other environment, and they would behave to some degree as they are within those environments. But if one is, I don't know, brought up in an abusive home, the way they would react and grow up, their attitude, their behavior and everything, the way they interact with other people would be different to the other person who grew up in a loving, caring, enfolding family, even though they're identical. And I think our environment, our family homes have an influence on our lives. I mean, both my parents were educated. My dad was an accountant, and he was, I don't know what I'll call it, he wasn't frugal with money, because I remember him buying stuff for us, ice creams and that, but he was like, right, I'm sending you to go and buy something for me, I want you to bring my change back, and he would check the change. And I don't know, that, and to some degree with my mom, but definitely that, I think made me more aware of being conscious of how I manage money. If I've got loads, then enjoy it like my mom would, and if I don't, manage it as my dad would. So he did have an influence with us, and he didn't spend that much time playing with us, but I remember we spent time with him, and I think that was a good influence, which was totally different to time with my mom.
It's interesting. With your situation, you were talking about your family and things, and your dad being abusive and things. Did you get a sense that he loved you, or he didn't love you, or was you not sure what was going on? You thought it was just normal?
See, that's an interesting question, and I knew my dad. Actually, he would say that he loved me, and I did believe it. I did believe that, and he always believed in me. He knew that I was going to amount to something, in education sense. He really believed that I was that. But the dichotomy of it all was that he was very, there was, I don't know, something that was bothering him, where he would behave in a very distractive manner. I mean, his behaviour, I mean, remember we were children going to school. I remember when I was about, I think about 8 years old in my junior school, and the night before, being a Sunday, he was violent, okay. And I remember at school, the teacher would say to all the children in the class, I was in a class of about 30 I think it was, in the 70s, and they'll say, so what did you do over the weekend? And the children would say, oh, I went down to the seaside with Granddad and I did this, and I said, and I was sitting down thinking, please don't ask me, please don't ask me, please don't ask me what my weekend was, because I don't know what I'd say. You see, unfortunately she never asked me, well, what did you do on the weekend, because it was dreadful. And so this became a regular pattern over the weekend, and it became quite the norm. What's interesting is, for me, is that you talk a lot about mental health. Fortunately, I haven't suffered. I mean, I have been affected by my experience. There's no doubt about that. My wife would tell you that, and my children would say that as well. And it does affect me in different ways. Fortunately, it hasn't affected me in terms of my mental health. And the reason why it is because I determined not to be a victim. I made a conscious decision. I'm not going to be made a victim of this. Sure, this has been my experience, but I'm not going to allow this to kind of imprison me. I struggled with this. I struggled with my father for many years. Though I loved him, I struggled with what he had done, and I hated what he had done. And I remember as a Christian, one time, you know, it was around the point where my mum had already passed away, so she died, and my dad was left, and I had the Bible open, and I was reading 1 John, and I got to chapter 4, and verses, I think it was verse 20 to 21. Now, up until that point in my prayer to God, and I struggled in my prayers, I would say to God, you know, change my dad, change my dad, change my dad. That would be my prayer. And it didn't happen. And I got to this passage in First John chapter 4, verses 20 to 21. Now, in that passage, in its context, it's talk about within the brotherhood, right? Where John says, how can you say you love God who you cannot see, yet you claim to love your brother, or you hate, and yet you hate your brother who you can see? And I read that passage, and I took the principle of that passage, although the passage was not talking about father and son relationship, it was talking about in the brotherhood. But I took that principle, and with that passage, with that thought process, I changed the prayer. And the prayer was, change me. That was the prayer I prayed, not change my dad, or that I've been praying for that. Ask God, change me. You know, change me. And because it was really, it was doing me some psychological damage, I have to say. And as I said before, I managed to protect myself from going down that road of being depressed. But I struggled struggled to be Christ-like in such a very toxic situation with my dad and what he had done. But what's interesting though, over time, I think what's also helped me is if God can forgive me for my sins, then I'd have to forgive my dad for what the offence he's caused towards me, and that was sometimes very difficult. So I have to understand. Once I understand how that God forgive me for my sins, then I've got to really be willing to forgive my father for the offence he caused me. And it was a struggle, but I do believe by God's grace that I managed it. So much so that I remember occasions where when my mum was ill, because my mum fell ill and she was crippled for 2 years. She was housebound and we looked after her. We thought there was a certain level of injustice because she suffered most of her life, and here my dad is up and about walking and the rest of it. But he suffered as well. He'd seen my mum suffered, he suffered as well. And I remember taking him away to Devon. We both went down to Devon. I felt sorry for him. And I think this is how mercy works. I really believe this is how God's mercy works. Mercy works in such a way that says this: you don't deserve this treatment. How I'm treating you, you don't deserve. But I will show you. But I will nonetheless treat you with kindness and mercy. And I do believe that's how God's mercy works for us in that respect. I didn't deserve some of the blessing that God has gifted to me, yet God gives it to me, even though I do not deserve it. And so that enabled me to do the same for my dad. In the sense that we went away, my mum was ill, when she was incapacitated, I felt sorry for him. I took her away down to Devon, and we spent some time in a chalet. And he met a few of the members of the church, because there was a church function that went on down in Devon. He didn't go to the church function, but he met a few of the members, because the Daniel boys, for example, Paul Daniel, we went away to the beach and all kinds of stuff, and he loved it. He loved the experience. And he often quite say to me that he really enjoyed that time together. So so there are moments which are very confusing, which my dad, in the absence of alcohol, was a nice man. But once there was something that was troubling him, that once the alcohol was in him, he became this, it was like a Jekyll and Hyde. And I remember when we were younger, when we were kids, we thought, because my mum used to complain, and we said, well, why did you marry him? You must have known what it was like back home. And she said to us, he was never like this back home. It's when he came to England. So something over here has got him to a point where he couldn't handle life struggles, that he had to find solace in the bottle. But the bottle brought the worst out of him. And
it's interesting, isn't it? Because again, when I look back on my upbringing, like I said, I haven't got a lot of happy memories. But I'm not saying that happy things didn't happen. I just can't remember a lot of them. I remember a lot of negative stuff, because there was a lot of negative stuff going on. So whether that's psychology, or I'm trying to block things out or not, I don't know. But I do know that, on one side I could see my dad, this caring side. And other times it would be like you said, it's like who's this person type thing. And I learned a lot more about my dad as I grew up, because my mum had opened up to me about some stuff that had been happening, and I remember becoming really angry with it, and that's possibly the reason why I turned to the alcohol and the drugs to block it all out and try and cope with it. But I was 30 years old, when I went to the Bible school. The first time I ever heard my dad say he loved me, and it totally caught me right off guard, because I've never heard it. I'm not saying he never said it, because I can't remember if he did or not, but it had an impact on me. And I was faced in a very similar scenario here. I had to look at myself and ask myself, good night, God's grace needs to be a lot to cover some of the junk I've done in my life, and who am I to withhold that from other people? So Fu and I were blessed in terms of we managed to speak to them both before they passed away about Jesus. I had a real good talk with them about it. They never accepted it, but I was glad that we were offering that same grace that we'd been given. But I want to ask as well, because I've heard some people say that the influence their father has on them has an effect on how you perceive God as the Father. So if you've been raised with a father that beats you up and does all these type of things, and people say, okay, you're going to pray to the Father now, that horrific thoughts are going through your head. The Almighty must be up there with this big iron rod ready to slap you every time you do something wrong type thing. And I've heard other people talking about they struggle with that. Have you heard that before?
I have heard it, but I don't. My dad never. I don't remember my dad smacking me. More like my mom smacking me. But my dad, yes. My dad smacking me, because he was. I said the quiet one, the gentle one that will do stuff and we'll just go away and just laugh about it. So, but I have heard people say that. And I think that's sad, because that is a bad projection of, a completely wrong projection of who God is and how, I mean, He is the ultimate parent.
Yeah.
And so when you then, your parent, your father has been nasty to you, beaten the daylight out of you, abused you physically, emotionally, mentally, whatever, then to have to call somebody else father or dad or whatever must conjure up and remind you of the difficulties that you had. So it's like, well, is he going to be the same? And I think people have to realize that God is not us. We are supposed to be like Him. He made us to be like Him in His image, in His likeness. But we fall short. People fall short to various degrees. And therefore, none of our parents are like Him anymore unless we decide we want to live and be like Him in Christ. Then we start learning how to be like Him. So being merciful, being gracious, that's not the norm. That occasionally might occur, but it's not the everyday thing that everybody does all the time. It's when you're in Christ, you start growing in that. You start seeing people differently. You start being able to look at somebody without thinking, I just want to walk out of here, or I don't want to talk to you anymore.
I think it's interesting, and you could come back in here in a second, Anthony, but when I reflect back on my life, like you said, I can't remember being told that I was loved. I can't remember it. Not to say it never happened, I just can't remember it. And
is that something that is more a British thing? My parents didn't quite say,
it might have been
I
a
love you
generational,
as
thing.
But what they did told you that they loved you.
But what I'm saying is that it's not until I got older and I realised that they did love me. When I look at the things, looking after me, bringing me up and closing my back, all these sort of things, maybe they just struggle to say the words type thing, and I think when we have an aspiration that God is like our physical father, it could become a real barrier.
Yeah.
But like you said, when you begin to look at the father for who he really is, then you start to look at things for who they really are. So I was going to ask you, Anthony, in terms of growing up in that environment, so when you got married and you have kids, was there a barrier like, I am not going to raise my children like this, or how did that work out?
Yeah, I made a conscious decision to give as much love as I possibly can to both my children in their formative years. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure I've got some things wrong because I carry parts of my past with me. So I'm sure they'll tell you that. But overall, I tried my best to be a faithful father and a loving father and a fair father. You're interested in your question about how does one perceive God, the Father, as a result of their own. For me, it's never a problem. I never saw God as this onerous being, as it were. It just didn't enter into my thinking. I do remember though listening to a program years ago called Focus in the Family, on one of these religious channels, and it was a very difficult topic dealing with child abuse. And one of the this is one that Dr. James Dobson was the host, and he had a guest speaker who was a Christian, and I think he was like an author himself, but he suffered from child abuse. I mean, physical abuse, probably sexual abuse from his father. And they put out a warning, because it was during the day, so they put out a warning to those got kids that just let you know this is this is we're going to discuss about if you've got kids, switch off or take them somewhere else. And he was asked, the guy who had been abused by his father was asked that question, how did you perceive God? And he said that he had a difficulty relating to God as a father because of what his father had done to him. And it took him, I don't know how many years it took him, but it took him quite a while to get to a point to understand that the Father that we serve at is no way near as the Father that he experienced growing up as a child. So it's an interesting question that you ask, because obviously some people perhaps do have that confusion.
And I'll tell you, I didn't really struggle with the concept.
No.
to a degree, but this might sound strange. My physical father, when I became a Christian, helped me see the Heavenly Father in a way that I never saw before, in terms of my relationship with him. So when I look at my relationship with my parents, especially my dad, it was very much broken, always broken. I was kicked out of the house back and forward. Police were always at the door and all kinds of things. And I used to hate my parents. I did. I absolutely hated them because I thought they hated me. Sort of mentality as you're a kid. But then I began to realise over the years that they still accepted me into their house despite of how I treated them. Despite of the verbal abuse I gave them back, despite all the trouble I brought on their doorstep with the drugs and alcohol and things, they still took that in. And it took me years to see that angle. And when I saw that angle, I was like, oh my word, this is exactly like a Heavenly Father. Because even as a child of God, I hurt him. I say things against him I shouldn't. I do things that I know I shouldn't. I cheat my brothers and sisters in ways that I know I shouldn't, type thing. And it's that like this merciful God, Father, who is continually, like the story of the prodigal son, where he goes away and comes back. It's that coming back, with the Father actually runs towards him, and that running is uninteresting because in Jewish mindset, you could only run when you lifted up the garments you were wearing, and to show your ankles was shunned against. So the very fact that the Father does that, it was like, to me it was like a moment thinking, my relationship with my Father is incredible. I just didn't see, although my mum and dad were religious in a sense, they were actually setting some kind of an example of what that grace, like you were saying, with the mercy, even though you don't deserve it, but they're still there. And it ties in with that verse you're talking about. And I think it's very powerful, especially when you, was it Paul that says, even when we're still sinners, Christ died for us. And I'm thinking, even though I didn't want anything to do with him, he still died for me. And it's those sort of moments that really just grab you as what a real Heavenly Father is all about.
I mean, that's how impactful the Word of God is. If you allow it to speak to your heart and be honest with that word, it will challenge you, to that place and change you. And when you look back and you think, how did I manage that? You have to come to the conclusion that God is at work.
Yep.
Yeah.
I can't tell you, I cannot say to you, oh yes, it was at that point that God was at work. I can't say that. I don't know. But looking back of it, I don't hate my dad. I love him.
Mm-hmm.
I know of family members who struggle with my dad to this day. And so, but I love him. And he knew I loved him. It was even more important. He knew I loved him to the end. But it's interesting how of all the family members, I was the one who found him, but dead. But
how did that? That must have been really hard, So
it was.
Your parents.
It was, because my mum, as I said, my mum died first in '94. She was ill for 3 years, and she died in hospital as a result of catching pneumonia. And I met her, and I saw her for the last time the night before, and I thought this was probably the last time I'll see my mum, which it was. I got the call 5 in the next day. Then someone had to tell my dad, and most family members would not speak to him, so I had to tell my dad that mum's gone. And when it came to my dad dying, I was getting ready to go to work. He's still in the house, so he had, had his own room. And I remember it was the night before where I knocked on his door to say that I'm gone to meet the church at Kentish Town, because sometimes I go to the church in Kentish Town in the evening just to support them because they're a small church in some ways. And I came back at that evening, within Sunday obviously, Sunday evening, I came back at 10 at night. I could see the light on in his rooms. I think I was probably still up. So I went to bed, got up next day, got myself washed, ready to go to work, knocked on his door, and I opened and said, Dad, I'll be gone, I'll see you. And there was no response. He was just lying there. I said, Dad, and he was just lying there. And I thought, it can't be. And so I went to him. I said, no. And I went to give him the kiss of life. I'm thinking that I just might catch him. Trying to revive his heart, thinking I just might catch him. Eventually I felt his legs, his feet, and they were ice cold. He's been dead a long while. And so eventually I had to phone the ambulance and to get them round to take him away. And the autopsy that came through, because I followed this up to find out what happened to him. And I was told, if my memory serves me correct, that he had a burst ventricle. Medically speaking, he had a burst ventricle. Emotionally speaking, I would say he had a broken heart. Mm-hmm. And he really was broken up. This is the extraordinary thing about this, is that my dad, for the years that I knew of him, was abusive to my mum in a very physical way. And yet he loved her. I don't understand that. I know she loved him, but it was a shadow of himself when my mum died. So much so, I remember when my mum died and she was in the mortuary, nobody would take him to see his mum, to see our mum. They thought he didn't deserve it. But again, grace. I showed grace, and I took him. I took him to see our mum, and he broke down. It's just strange. Confusing. This is so confusing that you shame us now, but you never did when she was alive. When it came to his funeral, I spoke to the vicar, and what I didn't want the vicar to say was he was a family man who did this and did this, because I said he didn't do that. This is what he was like. But if you could just do a funeral, which is, don't explain that he was like this, but just recognise it as a man who lived and whatever. And the vicar did do a good job. Once I briefed him what kind of person my dad was, of course he had. So in all that experience, which I've carried with me, I don't know why my dad was the way he was, but I can tell you now, I don't have any hatred for him, and I'm glad for it. And I can see the wisdom of having a forgiving heart, to be ready to forgive in a way that God is ready to forgive. If you come to Him, He will forgive, because He's ready to forgive. And we as Christians, as followers of Christ, we have to have a heart that is willing and ready to forgive. Not forgive, but be ready. So when the person comes to you, you're there to forgive. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand, yeah.
Yeah, because often you hear people say like, well, I'm not going to forgive until the person says to me, I'm sorry. Or you say, he's got to do this first. But if you look at how God operates, He's waiting to forgive, willing to forgive if you come to Him with a broken repentant heart.
Jesus says it, forgive us our debts as we forgive others.
Exactly. And so I found, I was not functioning really as a Christian when I had this moment in my heart where I found it difficult to forgive. I just couldn't function. So I had to, and this is the reason why I prayed that prayer, change me. And I had to learn to be ready to forgive him, my dad, if and when he asked for that. So it's there. And I have to say that for me personally, it's taught me a lot about myself and how God's mercy works. But also there's a sense of peace. There's something about, I can't explain it, but there's something about forgiveness and having a forgiving heart that enables you to function afterwards. Mm-hmm. Does it take away the pain? It doesn't take away the pain. There are moments, there have been moments where I've broken down over the years, privately. Sometimes in the moment publicly, in a moment like that, something triggers you, and it just But I'm glad that at this moment in time, I'm glad that I didn't harbour hatred in my heart when my dad passed away. I'm glad that my dad realised that I still loved him, in spite of what he had done.
So just two problems really. Do you find that because you became a Christian and God has been helping you in your heart, and you are now you were able to forgive your dad and have some kind of a relationship with him? Do you think that helped you or encouraged you to want to get people to go down that route as well and try and forgive him? Is the one question. The other question is, this must have taken you a while to get to where you are now. It wasn't sort of like overnight, and therefore, has this impacted on your kids and your children, because they're in their 20s now? So the effect on family has it made you want to say, come on, you can do the same as you've achieved, and then has this affected your kids?
Yeah, I that's a good question. I'm not sure if that is helpful. If I've overcome it, you can overcome it, because I think it depends on one's personality as well. I know of my brother who would refer to my dad as Mr. Newman, and I can understand why he's had issues with my dad. So I think it depends on your personality in that respect. What was the first question? That's an interesting one you made.
Because you're a Christian and you see the benefit of being in Christ and the ability to forgive, were you in a way kind of helping others or encouraging the rest of the family, especially your siblings who directly went through it as well, to kind of like, one, come into Christ and know God, because you knew that might help them, and then get them to forgive him as well? That wasn't. Did you have that conversation with them, or you just left them to deal with it their own way?
Exactly. Exactly that. Yeah. So we do it in our own way. It's not easy. I don't think it's very easy for siblings to say, look, I can do it, you can do it, kind of thing, because we're all different personalities, and we've all been affected very differently. For me, I just found that because I spent a lot of my time in the world. It's interesting because when I came to Christ not because of problems. The reason why I came to Christ because I wanted to know why I had to die. So there's a disconnect between my experience and why I came to. So I didn't like, well, I'm going to come to God because I wanted to get me out of the situation. That wasn't the remit. For me, it was, why do I have to die? So it was a total disconnect. There was no relatability. It was
not personal.
So when I was reading the scriptures, it was a very different path I was taking.
Yeah.
In spite of what was going on around me, I was searching for God. So it's different in that respect. And we all, we're grappling with what we try to, as kids and in our formative years as we go older, and in our teenage years as we go older. We're all trying to resolve this in our own different ways with the personality that we have, and that sort of conversation didn't exist for me to say, look, I can go for it, you can go for it too, because I was still wrestling with my own thoughts. I was still wrestling with my own thoughts, negative thoughts, dangerous thoughts. I wanted my dad killed. I wanted to hire somebody to kill him, and it was just too much. The what he was doing to us as kids growing up, and we're supposed to be doing our GCSEs and O-levels. Our school life was disrupted because of our dad, and so you just try the best you can with the situation that you're in, with regards to my children, I don't do that. I don't sort of say, well, come on, this is what happened to me, you can overcome it, because again, I don't think that kind of thing works, because every person's struggle is personal to them, and they can't relate to what I went through. I may offer some positive advice on how to overcome stuff, but I wouldn't say, at least I don't think I've said things like, come on, if I can do it, you can do it. If I've been through this,
no, I meant
because
of the way your dad treated you and the behaviour in the household when you were growing up. You'd obviously earlier said that you must have made decisions that you were not going to be like that.
That's right, yes.
Irrespective of being a Christian, you were not going to be like that. Yes. You were not going to behave in that way to your children. Yes. but there must have been times when certain things would have triggered. And I'm just wondering whether, because you mentioned that they could see the effect of
Yes.
the abuse you had on you,
They
you know.
they know of parts of my past because but yes, I mean, for example, I don't like shouting. There's a certain level of noises that I don't like because that's a lot of things. That was very much.
So that's what I mean.
Yeah.
The things
I hate
you can deal with. They realize, okay, this is why Dad's like this because of what's happened.
So if you ask Elma, she'll tell you there's a certain level of a woman's voice I don't like because that's what I had as a kid. I was shouting, screaming, and I'm talking about from as early as ages 4, 5, and so I like if we're gonna disagree, let's talk. We don't have to shout. Talk to each other, not at each other, but talk to each other, those sort of things that I've had from my past. I try not to have them in the family if I can, and there are things that I may do in my behaviour because of my background. But I think I've had a conversation with both my children, who I'm very proud of actually, and I think also with my daughter. I'm quite close to my daughter. I'm close to both of them in different ways, and I always ask them, have I been a good dad? Because I keep reassessing myself. Have I been a good dad? And I think they would say, yeah, well, yes, you have been. I might have been fair, but I think overall they think I've been a good dad, which I'm pleased about.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because you subconsciously, I think you measure yourself with your own father. I think that's what I did when we had kids, and I was determined not to raise them in that kind of environment that I was raised in.
Yeah.
And one thing maybe I did too much was just told them I loved them all the time, constantly all the time. It was like over the top. So maybe subconsciously that was in the back of my mind. But just before we wrap up here, I wanted to ask one last question. A lot of people who are raised in a really horrendous background with a horrendous father figure and things, they sometimes they grow up and they learn to resent their father and they hate the father, and like you were talking about earlier, do anything but be near the father. And I remember that song, I think it was Making the Mechanics, that sung about the living years.
Yes, that's right.
And it was talking about telling your father you loved them before it's too late type thing, and that was really moving. But when I first heard it wasn't moving until later in life when I understood it. So I deliberately went out of my way to tell my mum and dad that I loved them both, and I actually went as far as apologising. And I was apologising for a bunch of stuff that my mum and dad had forgotten all about. But going back to what you were saying with the passage earlier and things, it was like a massive release for me to say that I'm sorry for what I did, for the grief I brought into your life. And I'm like you guys have been saying, that I don't think you could say to other people this is the way you do it, because I don't think there is a set way to do it. But I do think there's a benefit in releasing that, because it's very powerful to forgive somebody and try and restore that relationship before it is too late, before it goes on. So if for people who's watching, what advice would you say to them who've been raised in that environment and are struggling with it now?
I wish I'd had a conversation with my dad to find out why he became the person that he became, or what made him found his comfort, or I don't know. Well, why did he do what he did through the unease of drink? Because something was bothering him, but he never did reveal it to us. And our mum certainly didn't share things with us. So if you're able to have a conversation with your dad, obviously when he's sober, not when he's drunk, then talk to your dad. But also be willing, be ready, be prepared to forgive. Don't harbour it in your heart, because it's like a cancer. Mm-hmm. It can kill you. it can kill you emotionally, probably and damage you psychologically. And so have a heart that's ready. It's going to hurt, but have a heart that's prepared and willing to forgive. So that when the person seeks your forgiveness, you are at a place where you can forgive, because you've dealt with those emotions. Overall, there are. It doesn't come easy. A lot of prayers required. I found, as I say, reading the scriptures was very helpful for me. Can I just make a quick point? There's one thing that came to my mind about the effect that, as I say, a lot of conversation is about male growing up in toxic environments and they've been influenced by the Andrew Tates as well and all the rest of it. I have to say, my dad, he did damage me, not physically. Mine wasn't physical, but mine was more emotional. I mean, I was very, very, at times, kind of withdrawn. I used humour to hide behind my shyness. I was very slow at coming forward amongst my peers. I lacked confidence. One of the things that really affected me was low self-image. Because of the environment you brought up in. So whereas my brother, on the other hand, he was confident. It's interesting how things affect siblings differently. My brother was the reverse. He had a tongue in his head. He was bold and everything. Whereas for me, the influence of what happened in our childhood, it affected me so much that I became more withdrawn, and didn't have the courage to speak up and things like that. So it does affect people differently. But going back to your point there, Mike, is the important thing is that if you have a willing heart, it's not easy, but try and be ready to forgive. Don't offer it out freely, so I forgive you. That doesn't work. I think you need to be at a place where you're ready to forgive, so that when the person does come to you, if he or she, if you have an abusive mother, does come to you, then you're at the point where you can forgive. But you need to pray about it quite often and reflect on it, and reflect on God's love for you and what God has done for you in your life, and then hopefully you're able to, show that to others who have offended you. And it's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to leave the last word to Fiona.
I think it's also important to mention that anybody who is still in the midst of it right now, don't just stay in that situation. There is help out there, there's support groups out there,
Yes.
You can report it, you can get help. Don't just sit in it and hope it will just suddenly go away, because it doesn't just suddenly necessarily just go away, or that you feel that you have to just bear it until you're beaten to death or you're emotionally,
Yes.
Get help,
because
get the support.
in our day it exists. In our day, child line. In our day, looking out for families that didn't exist. The law wasn't there to protect those sort of families.
And I think, just very quickly as well, that men are notorious for holding things in.
Yes.
Absolutely notorious for holding things in for whatever reason.
Yes.
But I think that if you know somebody pretty close to you, you could open up to and talk to, that would be a massive help, because there are people, even grown-ups in their 30s, 40s, 50s, that are still carrying this stuff, still struggling with it, because they've got nobody to talk about, because they feel embarrassed about it, because back in the day, if you were a man, you were expected to carry everything, all the load, and Superman type thing, but we know that that's not the case now. But anyway, thank you again for watching. Thank you for Anthony, and again thank you for Fumi, and we'll see you next time. God bless. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.